Chapter 3. My Father's Store. The store stood at about the center of town, and the neighbors around would use the front lanai, or veranda, as a meeting place. Some of the boys would bring their guitars and sing, while others would gossip about their neighbors, but it was nothing to worry about. The store sold everything that was bought from the city. It also bought native products to sell, such as fruits, animals, and fish. It was a big business. All my father had to keep accounts of the transactions were his memory and one metal abacus. Being the oldest, I was the handy helper in the store. With the system used by my father, no records were kept. When he bought, he paid in cash or exchanged in goods. Whatever account was carried over was kept in his memory, and my mother would record in a book the name and the account during the day. The amazing part was figuring out each pound by multiplying, dividing, and adding, at which time he used the abacus and sold either by the piece or the full amount. My father did not read or write, so my mother did this for him. As I helped in the store, he always showed me the shortcuts in buying and selling. The license to operate a general merchandise store was $25 per year. The tax on selling tobacco was about $10, and there were other taxes I was not familiar with. He also had a coffee shop and sold biscuits and donuts. His store was open 7 days a week from 4 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock at night. The fisherman who picked his shrimp in the pond stopped at the coffee shop for his coffee and biscuits and then went off to their canoes. They returned about 10 or 11 o'clock with mackerel, called opelu. They brought them to the store in bamboo baskets. Each basket, when filled to the top, was 1 ka'au, or 40 fish, and 2.5 baskets made 1 lau, or 100 fish, more or less. For each basket, my father would quote the price. If they accepted it, they usually exchanged the fish for merchandise instead of money. The fish had to be cleaned by cutting the back of the fish to the tail, then cutting the fish head in half. Then the intestines were pulled out and rubbed on the fish meat, which would give it a reddish color. Then the fish was rubbed with salt and placed in a pan. The fisherman would do this work for a meal of rice and stew. In the morning, I took the fish out from the pan and dipped each fish in a clean bucket of fresh water to get the salt out. I then dried them on the roof where it was facing the hot sun. As soon as the meat turned a dark red color, I turned them on their backs. By 3 o'clock, I picked up the fish to check and see if they were dry. The inside of the fish was raw. When you broiled the mackerel, it tasted like fresh opelu. I had to pack them in a bundle of 10 each. To do this, the tails of the fish had to be together. Then setting 5 on each side at opposite ends, they were tied with a string, which was bark from an olona tree, at both ends and in the center. The bundle sold for 25 cents to 50 cents. Fishing was a big business, and fish was a fast-selling item. There was no refrigeration or ice, so the fish had to be salted to preserve them. If the fish was fresh, you had to set them in an open box with tea leaves set inside the box. Then you laid the mackerel in and covered them with tea leaves and sprinkled them with water and kept them damp all the time until they were all sold, either in the store or delivered. Mackerel had to be caught in the morning and sold and delivered the same day. Whatever was not sold had to be salted and dried. The fishermen usually prepared to fish for mackerel or opelu in the summer months. The first 3 days in the week, all the fishermen could do was find the school of fish and feed them with shrimp bait. The next day they made the first catch. They brought their canoe in and placed 1 fish on the fish rock, ku'ula. Then they gave fish to those who came down to the landing to help pull the canoe ashore. If there were some that were just standing and looking, they had to receive at least 1 mackerel. The rest was divided into 3 equal parts for the 3 fishermen who picked what they wanted to take, and what was left was for my father to make an offer for. If accepted, my father started back to work. When everybody left the landing, the owner of the ku'ula rock would pick it up and throw the fish that he had placed on it into the sea. He would then wrap his ku'ula in a red tapa cloth and take it home. From then on out, you didn't use the ku'ula rock. You could catch your own mackerel and do what you wanted. When summer was over, there was no mackerel fishing. In the meantime, other mackerel, called akule, came in schools near the small cove. The fishermen got into their canoes and with a long net surrounded the school of fish and brought the net to the cove and left the net at the entrance. They used small nets to haul the school of fish in small batches. It would take about 2 weeks to clear the cove. Every batch of fish was hauled in a wagon to be sold at the next town as a fresh catch. The rest of the fish that were left, my father would buy from the fishermen. It was salted and dried. He stocked the fish and sold it in his store. And also he took some to the city to be sold for a better price. When there was no fish to be sold in the store, they bought salt salmon instead. A 10-pound salt salmon sold for $1. For a small family, it would last about 2 weeks. During the winter season, when there were no fish to catch, the fishermen sat under the pandanus tree and repaired their nets. Others would refit new parts on their canoes and paint them. I used to help them and would listen to their tales of fishing. I learned a lot about canoeing by taking a canoe out when the waves were high as 6 feet and learned to bring it in. You watched the first 3 waves that rolled in if you were going out. The first wave would roll to shore and return. The second wave would meet the first wave. This break would help the third wave to slow up the following wave. You would paddle your canoe out while the second wave met the third wave, so you would pass all the wave breaks. On coming in on the canoe, you watched for the 3 waves and had to be ready to ride on the third wave, which would bring you in with a smooth ride. Sometimes there was a freak wave, or you might have miscounted, or there happened to be 4 instead of 3. But you had to stay on the third wave even if you had to paddle hard to reach it. If you missed, you had to go back and wait for another 2 waves to be sure to come in smoothly. Since there was no fish to be bought from the fishermen, my father planned to take me to Kama'ili by way of Keonona. From Kalapana to Keonona was about 8 miles. 1 mile from Keonona was the rubber plantation owned by Mr. Henderson. From there to Kama'ili, which is near the ocean side, was about 5 miles. From Kama'ili to Kalapana was about 13 miles. We went on foot, and I had shoes but would rather walk barefooted and carried my shoes on my shoulder. There were places where the road was rocky with lava, called a'a, thrown on and not yet rolled. My father would then carry me on his shoulders. He was a big man and stood 6 feet and weighed about 220 pounds. He belonged to the working class. His whole life he worked and never drank cold water, but always drank tea, hot or cold. He had good health all his life. We left Kalapana at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was clear, and by 2 o'clock we arrived at Keonona. Only about 3 families lived there. I remembered the Elderts, who lived on the ava root plantation. Ava is grown in a wet forested area. The root of the ava plant weighs about 500 pounds. It is chopped into small pieces and dried and packed in gunny bags that weighed from 75 to 100 pounds. It was shipped to Germany for medicinal purposes. My grandfather lived in Pahoa. He planted ava root up the mountain near Pahoa Forest. On vacations, I usually came to live with my grandparents. When he brought home the ava root all chopped up, my aunts would wash it and begin to chew it and set it in a bowl. When the bowl was full, my grandmother would mix it with a little water and squeeze it through a mosquito cloth. When all the juice was out of the ava root, the root was put in the garbage pail. The ava root juice was poured into a wooden calabash and put away for special occasions. The only time I have seen such a special occasion was when my cousin had a birthday. They had a little family luau. I saw my grandparents, aunts, and uncles participate in the ava drink with a little ceremony with a prayer for the health of the little girl. And then each would sip from the same bowl as it was passed around. After the second round, they stretched on the mat floor, and in about an hour, they were fast asleep. We picked up all the remaining food and cleaned up the place. By that time, it was midnight, and I went to sleep. When I look at the ava plant, I remember this occasion. After lunch, we started through the rubber plantation. After a 3-mile walk, we stopped at Atong's house and rested. Atong used to work for my father at Pahoa. He wanted us to stay for the night, but my father said we must leave. After we had a few bites, we left at about 5 o'clock. By 7 o'clock, we were nearing the beach, but it was getting dark, so we stopped near a house. Nobody was home, and when we looked in the window, it seemed that the house had been empty for some time. No animals were around the house. My father said we would sleep on the veranda until morning. We both had raincoats. I laid my raincoat down, but father rolled his into a pillow to lay his head on. I slept on his arm. At about midnight, I heard my father talking. This is what he said in Hawaiian. I came here with my boy and sleep on your veranda. I mean no harm. Please let us both stay until morning. I could see the moon in the sky, which was a little hazy. My father told me to go back to sleep, but the ghost still bothered him by pulling his leg. By this time, he was mad and began to swear in Chinese. I think it was then about 4 o'clock in the morning. We picked up our raincoats and started down the steps. All the time my father was swearing. I did not see a thing. We walked about a mile and came to a small pond with a few coconut trees growing on a high bank. As I looked up, I didn't see any coconuts, so I laid my raincoat down and fell asleep. My father did not sleep. At this time, when at home, he was always up and cooking. As dawn approached, he shook me to get up and wash my face. We started walking, and soon we were on the main road headed back to Kalapana. After a 2-hour walk, we came to a Hawaiian home. This was the place my father came to collect his bill. They paid part of the bill and told my father that for the rest of it, he could have a lot next to the house. Father said he would let them know later when he talked to my mother. He spoke of the incident of the night before at the house where we slept on the veranda. The owner of the place died. People came later, and they had to leave as they could not sleep at night. The last family moved without taking anything out of the house. It had been 5 years since then, and we were the last to know what it was all about. After we had breakfast, we left Kamaili for Kalapana. We got home just before dark. For many years, my father operated the little store. When it came time to make further changes, he moved back to Pahoa to live a retired life. 2 of my younger brothers, Peter and George, and I went to Hilo to attend St. Mary's School and live at the Father Lewis home. We lost our sister, Alice, in an accident in Honolulu when she was attending the Honolulu School for Teachers. Father Everest, a Belgian priest, had his eyes on having his new church built in the center of Kalapana, so he asked my mother to sell our property to the church. Being a staunch Catholic, she sold the house and land for $1,000. Father Everest, with a few helpers, built the church with the store lumber. The church stood on the same spot where the store was first built. After it was finished, he painted the inside of the church, and the dome was the Blessed Virgin Mary. The church was named the Star of the Sea. I heard him say that other churches were painted like the one in Kona, so why not Kalapana? All the painting was done by him alone. Patience was the fruit of his reward. Today, that church is one of the historic figures of old Kalapana.